Thank you for joining me today. I'm Madeline Blair, and this is Unlocked. You can't have a successful career without knowing how to deal with the unexpected, and Unlocked is here to help you do exactly that. This is a show all about opening possibilities so that when you're hit with the unexpected, you have options from which to choose. Our topic today is creating transformational spaces, or you might say finding a firm foundation when everything is shaking. Our agenda is that we're going to have a great conversation with my guest, Mary Alice Arthur, followed by an exercise that you can do. I'm excited to see what Mary Alice is going to bring to us. And lastly, I'm going to, in my new segment, be talking about a book that has made an enormous influence on my life and career. So stay tuned to find out what that book is. All right, let's bring Mary Alice onto the screen. Mary Alice, welcome to Unlocked.
Thank you so much for the invitation. You know, I love being in conversation with you.
Oh, thank you. And I guess I really should say, welcome again to Unlocked, because there are a few people that come back and back, and I love it. I love it. Well, let me tell the audience again who you are. Mary Alice Arthur is a story activist using story to help create a positive systemic shifts and for applying collective intelligence to the critical issues of our times. Oh, I'm excited about that. Her art is in creating brave and transformational spaces where people can find and live into the stories that take them to their most flourishing future. In other words, she helps individuals and groups find meaning in the stories they are living every day. Mary Alice is considered to be a foremost in building the capacity for people to take back the power of their stories so that they can make wiser choices. Today, Mary Alice has taken her wisdom and put it into the book. Here it is, 365 Alive, Find Your Voice, Claim Your Story, Live Your Brilliant Life, where she guides the individual to mine the gold from their own stories. Again, welcome, Mary Alice, to Unlocked.
Thank you so much, Madeline. Lovely to be here.
Good. All right. Well, this is going to be a different conversation than I normally have because we haven't firmed up on exactly the questions that we're gonna go over, but who knows? I think this is going to be a better conversation as a result. But I know where I want to begin because, Mary Alice, one of the reasons I love the fact that you wanted to talk about transformational spaces is that I look around at the people that I'm working with and counseling and mentoring, and there's a lot of anxiety. In fact, I think if I remember the statistics, there are like 6 or 7 million people, adults in America, who suffer from generalized anxiety disorder, some level of it. We're living in a crazy time of change and, so many technologies, career paths that have abrupt endings, college students who are digitally wise, and their professors don't know how to relate to them. And then there are the teenagers who are desperate to get into college, knowing that they may still not have a job at the end. I mean, these are anxious times. What do you think about that? What do you see?
I think we have, it's interesting as I look at the story we're living in right now, because we've talked a lot over the COVID period of people feeling disconnected, but it's actually not started in the COVID period. It was already coming. And for me, how I could easily see that, I grew up in Indiana in the 60s. And at that point in time, there were not a lot of fences around. We kind of ran around through everybody's yard. Nobody locked their door. You'd kind of throw the door open, shout, hello, and walk in. That might also say something about the neighborhood I lived in. So, I fully get it if that was not your experience growing up. But there was a time in my father's time, everybody would sit on the front porch in middle America and kind of fan themselves because it was really hot in the summertime, drinking iced tea and watching everybody on the road. So, citizens alert was already existing in the way that people were connected. Everybody knew their neighbors. As we moved to the backyard and then set up fences and then kind of, I think that was around safety or around privacy or whatever, but we've been isolating ourselves from each other. And sometimes, if it's very cold out for most of the winter, you won't see your neighbors but briefly.
Mhm.
You don't even know who your neighbors are. So the story of kind of retreating into my paradise, into my own zone, in my own car, in my own house, in my own place, in my own bubble, kind of got exacerbated during COVID. And I think the bigger picture of who we are as a society needs a look at the moment, because we're seeing some of the downsides of that, and anxiety is one of them. I think violence is one of them. People feeling so disconnected that they are disconnected enough from other humanity to treat people in a very violent way. And I think trying to control others is one of them too, because the more afraid we are, the more we try to control the situation to feel some level of comfort. So it's interesting to ask people right now to be a bit more self-reflective. Hey, like, what's the story we're actually in? And realizing I could do something about that in the way I decide to perceive what's going on in the story I tell myself, first of all, and then the story I decide to be in with somebody else. So that's where I get really, really curious. What's really going on here?
As you were describing that, I thought about the recent story of the man in the subway, New York City, who died because he had, I know he had mental issues, but what I sensed from what you were saying and what I read was that he was in his own way trying to reach out and reconnect with people. It's not to, to justify his behavior, but to understand it, I think is important. Because this really is, in those situations, very desperate moments. And that raises anxiety, even if you're not that person, just because being present or even just reading it had me concerned. So how do we use story to enter that? I liked your comment about, what's the story we're telling right now? Because this is the story we're telling right now. A man in the subway who gets killed.
Yeah. I thought about this on Monday in the Story Dojo, which is my community. I had invited a friend who's also a storyteller. And she's also a refugee from Ukraine and is now in Germany for 4 months, I think, 4 or 5 months now. And I've been following her story on Facebook. I mean, it's quite riveting when somebody says, all right, we have to walk. We're going to walk to the bus to maybe get us out of here. It's going to be 14 kilometers. I can't tell you exactly where we're going because we don't know what's being tracked and what isn't. This is quite riveting stuff. And then to watch her unfold over time. And my question to her as we were listening was, how has story or being a storyteller supported you in this journey or helped you see it in a different way? And most people who were in the circle on Monday were saying to her, you're amazing because you've made so much out of this very challenging challenge. And she made it an opportunity. And she said, it's because I love learning so much. So that's number one. I love learning. And stories are the way we help each other learn, right? We're telling stories to somebody else to help them understand a situation or to be understood by them. And in an organizational setting or in a group, we tell those kind of stories to help somebody align with the values and know how their behaviors are impacting us and to know what we think is important. And that would commonly be called connection. And connection leads to understanding, right? But Tatiana was saying that she had made friends with a German person who took her to a party, and she kind of introduced herself to everybody and had an interesting time. But the second time she came, she said it was almost like they forgot who I was. And they started telling a story. All the refugees have an easy route. They're just taking all the stuff, blah, blah, blah. And she felt incredibly confronted and kind of offended by that because she had worked very hard to try to get a job, to make meaning in her life, to try to participate and to contribute. And she had worked really hard to try to learn German quickly in order to do that. So that was definitely not her story. And I said to her, I was an exchange student in Germany in the mid-70s, and they were telling that same story with a different antagonist at the time. And then when the wall came down, they were telling the same story about East Germans and West Germans, and now it happens to be the refugees. You have been struck by a dominant narrative.
Mm.
But what else I learned from her story is when she had to go over the bridge crossing the river, which her grandfather had had to swim in World War II, so there was no bridge there, but she's having to walk over this bridge. She said, I switched on my storyteller in that moment because that enabled me to float above myself. And that meant fear could not overwhelm me in the moment I had to make this walk where none of the public transport, none of the cars were going, but I could do it because the storyteller was with me. And now, as I look in retrospect, and it's been hard, they had to live in a basement with no windows and very little heating for 3 months. And, everything was up in the air and they didn't know anything about what life was going to be like. She said, now I have to put the story, I'm going to switch on the storyteller again, because when I tell my stories, I can connect with my emotion again, which I've had to put away because everything was so hard. And now when I'm telling you this story, I can feel more than I did before. And then the last thing she said, which really struck me and the whole group, was she said, right at the moment, it's not possible to engage in long-term thinking. I don't know how long I'll live here. I don't know how long we'll be here. And that's making it really hard to contribute to society and feel like I'm a valuable member. But because of that, I've decided to plan deeply. And I've decided to engage with my life as fully as possible in every moment. And the storyteller is helping me there too.
Wow. What a deep story.
Mm.
Yeah. When you began this, you said this was in your story dojo. Talk about that. What is a dojo and how would you do a story in a dojo?
For anybody who doesn't know the word dojo, it's a Japanese word, and it's made up of two parts. Do is the way. So usually a martial arts practice will be in a dojo, and that might be karate or aikido or whatever kind of martial arts people do. It usually happens in a dojo. So the do, the D-O-J-O is dojo. So the do is the way. So you would be practicing karate or you'd be practicing aikido. In this case, we're practicing story. And jo is the place of practice. So dojo is the place where you practice your way. And I like the concept. I'm not a martial arts person, but I've been in the circle with somebody who was quite a well-practiced aikido person. And what I love very much is the discipline around that. Mm-hmm. When you're part of the dojo, you take care of the dojo. So usually people start by cleaning the space. They contribute to the space. Mm-hmm. And then when you're going to practice with somebody, you go onto the mat. So there is a focus. And then you say, please, will you practice with me? So there's a very respectful invitation to be in practice together, to be in learning together. And I've been to an Aikido dojo where I watched people throwing each other around, and they were actually very joyful throwing each other around. I was over 50 at the time, so I watched this and I said, I've been working on my back for a long time. Maybe this is not for me, but I really like it. So I invited that kind of idea in as I thought about my own online community. How do we stay in practice together? How do we care for the space together? How do we be respectful as we're inviting people to engage with us? Because story can be powerful and tender. It can be really right at your edge, especially if you're exploring or working with something you want to shift or something you want to. It's time to expose this story in my life, but how do I tell it in a way that doesn't ask anybody who's listening to be in therapy with me, but rather is inviting them to come to a point of reflection, a point of insight, a point of understanding. How do I do that well? So, how do I take the audience with me, not freak them out, or process something myself in a place it's not appropriate to do that with? That's why being in a place of practice is really important.
I like the distinction between a place where you are practicing, and it's through your story, that you're not really inviting someone to analyze your story for you or help you solve whatever the problem is. That's not the point. The point is to be a receiving place so that you can tell the story comfortably,
Yeah.
and give a gift to the group.
See, the opposite there is interesting too, because not only telling stories is important, but how to listen to a story.
Yeah.
Vitally important for anyone, and especially anybody in leadership. How do I really hear underneath the surface what somebody is offering me as intelligence about what's going on in our system?
Mm-hmm.
Because every story people share is telling you something about what's going on, what's important to people, maybe what they're not voicing in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
But all of that is intel, and therefore all of it is valuable. And it also tells you something about the health of any organization. You know, the questions people ask, the conversations they're in, the stories they tell, all of that says something about the health and vitality of any system.
Mm-hmm.
So listening well into that is a really important skill set.
Yeah, for sure. You know, it also reminds me that story becomes a what's the right word to say this? Story becomes a way in which you can communicate these things in a more open fashion.
Yeah.
I was thinking of Judith Glaser, and she's the author of Conversational Intelligence, and she talks about the fact that transformational conversations, and we're talking about transformational space, engaging with others in high levels of openness, candor, curiosity, wonder, stimulating provocative questions. I mean, these are scary things if you don't have a vehicle that allows you to easily share that intel, as you called it.
Yeah. And that's a very important thing to notice, because all of our movement forward really is based on trust and collaboration.
Yeah.
That's why the human race has been successful up until now. And maybe we're coming to that point of really questioning, how much are we using what we really know about being successful right at the moment? So it's not about overt competition or closing everyone else out. It's about, how do we make connection so that we understand where to go further and we're better together. So this point she's making about conversation, I think, is a very rich one. So the other part of my work is really around hosting. How do we create transformational spaces where people can lean in and do the work together instead of falling apart? You know, it takes a longer time to do tough work, what people call wicked questions, you know, the thing that isn't going away, but it's going, hey, look at me. And most of these wicked questions are actually knotted up together. So if you want to talk about hunger, you have to think about poverty and health and how people are treated and justice and all those kind of things. None of those are existing alone. They're kind of knotted story fields, I guess you would say. So I love it that she's talking about conversation. I think conversation is a medium of transformation. The challenge is, what kind of conversation are you having?
Mm-hmm.
You know, is it, and she's talking about transformational. I love that, because I often think to myself, there's two kinds of questions. There are transactional questions, what I would call the what's for dinner question. And then there's transformational questions, the one that makes you, what we call in the art of hosting field, the question that makes you tremble, meaning you want to say yes and shout, oh no, at the same time, because it's offering you an incredible potential, but is scary. Mm-hmm. Those are the kind of questions we need to engage in more. And the challenge with focusing totally on the problem-solving approach is we never get to the edge of that kind of question. But stories are a way that we can build the trust to go there. So I'm thinking about, years and years ago, I was in Japan, and I was part of a team that was hosting a conference based around the UN agenda of the time. And the part of the UN agenda I was given was called Disconnection and Barriers to Engagement. So negatively stated. At one point in time, our sign fell off the wall and we couldn't get it to go back up. And I thought, this is actually metaphorically interesting. Because, so we renamed ourselves Engagement and Connection, and things went much better from that moment on. But we invited people to go away and interview each other, do an appreciative inquiry interview, which is actually appreciative inquiry doesn't call itself a story-based methodology, but it really is. It's inquiring into people's experience. Yes. And there's gold in everyone's lived experience. Mm-hmm. So interesting side note here, the part to harvest the gold of people's lived experience and to redignify them through their story is really important. Once that happens, once we can truly hear each other, then it's like I say we depth the field. It's like we grow a root system together. But you could also say we rise to a different possibility. Anyway, we invited people to go off and do a little appreciative interview about connection and engagement. And there was one group of 3. There were 2 young women and a young man who went away and did this. And they came back and reported on their experience. And they said to us, the young man said, I get engaged and then I get connected. And the young women said, we get connected and then we get engaged. And I think there's something really important there about the way that we approach things. Some people need to do the work and then they learn about people and they get engaged with them. And some people need to hear the story, understand something about the people before they can step in. Both of these are valid pathways, and both of them can really be assisted by storytelling. Because the moment I learn something about somebody, I can never see them the same again.
That's right. That's why I often say when I'm working with groups and using story as one of the tools, I say, remember, every story that's told, a personal story that is sacred, because someone has said, this is a little bit of who I am. You reveal something of yourself. And so you always set ground rules that you're not going to share that story unless the person gives you permission, for example. But it is a very revealing place, but safe place, because the story is your story. It doesn't need to be right or wrong. It's just your story.
And it's important to pay attention to that little thing that you just said about putting some ground rules around that, because I think especially now as we're talking about race, we're talking about difference, we're talking about diversity. It's easy for anyone who's been in a privileged position to say everybody should share. But that's not the case if you have had what you shared being taken. I worked with a group. I was once invited to talk about story to a group of educators in the west coast of Canada. So this is around British Columbia. And they told me as we came into the call, oh, by the way, this call is all for Indigenous educators. And I was like, oh, I feel like I'm now taking cold in Newcastle. If there's anybody who knows about the power of story, it's our Indigenous fellow people, because that's the way they've traditionally always learned, and how they learn to be in their families and in their society and in their way of practice. But I was listening. I thought, I don't know how I can be helpful here. That was one of the, but I decided the best thing I could do would be to be a powerful listener. Mm-hmm. And I heard one woman say, I tried to tell my colleague how it was for me, and he said, that never happened. Which is one of the worst things you can ever do to somebody, because, of course, everyone's experience is their own experience. I said this once to a client. They said, how can you prove to me that everybody has a different experience on something? I said, have you ever been to a family gathering where people came away from the dinner table and said, what was that? And he went, yeah. And I said, have you ever been to a meeting where people come out of the meeting and go, what was that? And they all have a different story. He went, yeah. I said, there you go.
Well, I had a former police officer come and speak. Dan Jones is his name. And he was actually talking about Tai Chi as a way in which you can have a calm center so that you can act calmly, have active calm, or calm. Yeah, active calm, he called it. And he talked about the fact that the first thing you do after an accident is the police officer goes around and gets the witnesses to describe. And he said, that you're going to get, if you have 5 witnesses, you're going to get 5 different stories. And within that, there's some truth, but you can't depend on just one. Yeah. So he had the same impression from a different perspective. Yeah.
So this is, it's an interesting question about what will we do with what we learn?
Yeah.
And who is carrying what piece of it? And could we say that all of those perspectives, no matter what they are, and even especially if they're ones we really don't like, are valuable in some way? How do we hold the space in a way that people can approach each other and truly listen to each other? Because we've gotten into a very polarized conversation in a lot of realms. And a friend of mine who lives in Greece was once telling a story about Greece and the financial crisis. And she said, we Greeks have learned something in this time. We've learned that when you lose your fundament, you become fundamentalistic.
Hmm.
And by that she meant when we lose the way we've known how to live on the land and live together collectively, when that falls apart, then people try to start controlling each other. And that statement, I think it was 2015, I was doing a series on refugees at the time. That's when the Syrians were coming into Europe, and there was a big whirling around that. And I remember her distinctly saying that, and it's stayed with me ever since because it's so potent. When we lose our fundament, we become fundamentalistic. So your police officer is talking about how do you keep your fundament, your ground, your foundation when you're in chaos. The first thing you can do is remember to breathe. Very important part of being human.
Right.
You stop breathing, that part will end. But the deeper you can breathe, the more calm you will have. Because when we get surprised, our breath comes up here, everything stops. And that what happens is we go out of the cognition that's in the front of our brain, which is the executive, and we go into the reptilian brain. So the first thing we can do is remember to breathe and remind ourselves who we're intending to be in this conversation. So it's actually a good practice to think to yourself, who do I want to be in this conversation?
You know, what you're saying here, Mary Alice, suggests to me that your dojo really could, I mean, I don't want to discourage people from going to your dojo because I've been there and it's wonderful to have that special place. And you know it's special because it's held well. But how they could bring that dojo into their own lives to explore their stories. Is that maybe what you were trying to do in your book? To give people a chance, even for themselves, to explore their stories.
Yes, because I think that we're at a point in time in the world, maybe we've always been there, but it's even more potent right now as we're so connected. It's a time to be more conscious, especially when if you feel overloaded, if you feel disconnected, if you feel like things aren't happening the way you want them to. It's time to be more conscious about what do you want? Who have you decided to be? What story do you actually want to be living in? So this book is intended to step somebody through the pieces and parts of story. So it starts out, it's got 4 segments in it. The first one is really about what is story. How can you be curious about what story is and how it's working? So story is like the chemical reaction in the background. It's always percolating, And sometimes I've been listening to people going, wow, that's an incredible story you've decided to be in right now. If we actually give ourselves the perspective, take this perspective as a strange one for your afternoon, it's all made up. We've made up everything. We have a story about everything. We could remake the story. So the second part is really about mapping your personal story field, because the stories you're carrying from your family, from your ancestry, from your culture, from your society, from your friends and neighbors, from your workplace, all of those are secretly or not so secretly influencing you every day. So it's really interesting to become aware of those. And I know you have that practice of continuing to write down your stories. I know that's one thing you suggest around your resilience practices is keep writing down your stories, because the more you know about who you are, the less you're triggered by somebody else's stories. And so many of us are getting triggered now. That's one reason the anxiety is so high. We're being really unkind to each other in a variety of media. And fast and furious, and we're addicted to the likes and what happens if nobody hears me or sees me. And it's much harder these days than it ever was. And then the third part of this work in this book is about story in the world. What are all the things story can do? Story can help you take back your power. It can help you connect with somebody else. It can help us understand each other. It can make possibilities. It can open the door to things. It can be a way shower. All of those. So a little bit of study on what are the aspects of how story can actually positively influence us. And the final bit is about your future story, because the question is, where does it go from here? And the underlying question in all of this is, who's in the driver's seat in your life? Is it you or is it your story? So those of us who've suddenly found ourselves down this road and we went, how did I get here? It's because you weren't in the driver's seat. The story was. And the story will kind of keep unfolding and give you the roadway and give you the frame unless you're aware of it. And, our dear friend Paul Costello says, the only way we're all dancing on the dance floor. The only way to see who's playing the tune is to get on the balcony and have a look.
Okay, then I'm going to put us up on the balcony and you down on the dance floor, because I want you to tell the story of why did story become so central to your life. I mean, you are one of the leading voices in the area of the exploration of the use of storytelling. How'd you get there?
I think it became so intriguing to me because it took me a while to realize that there was such a thing. I was in my 30s when I went to a storytelling festival, the first one that happened in New Zealand, and I really saw in front of me story impacting people. So I didn't grow up in a household. I say to friends sometimes, I don't think I grew up in the household of story. I grew up in the household of secrets.
Ooh.
I had a dad who went to World War II. His father was in World War I. These were not men who told a lot of stories, they weren't gregarious like that. And in fact, the first time I heard any stories about World War II was when my father came to New Zealand and he was with my boyfriend's family. And I suppose another young man at the table somehow initiated some stories I had never heard before. Or perhaps I didn't know to ask questions. That also could be the case. So when I was in this festival, I saw it and I was like, something just happened and I wonder if I could do it. The truth is every human being is a storyteller because that's how we're coded. Science would say we learn stories already before we're born. We are hearing them in the womb. And I heard that one of my most favorite stories happened in a conference where we asked people to share a moment of magic or mystery in small groups. And then they sent 5 people to the front to share their stories because their groups had thought their story was so important. Everybody should hear it. And there was this one young Danish man when his child was in the womb, his wife was pregnant. He used to sing a very complicated Danish children's song into his wife's belly. And he would do that every day. And then finally the child was born. I think he stopped singing the song at that time. But he said at some point in time, the child was about 2 years old, 2.5. And it was bouncing. He was bouncing on the bed like kids do, bouncing. And suddenly he turned around, he faced his parents, and he sang the song. And there was a pause in this, like there's this pause in the story and in the group at the moment. And then this guy, Lars, said, and today he's 15. This is his birthday. And I said to him afterwards, I think you were so surprised that he heard you. So, life is influencing us. The stories are influencing us from a very, very young age. So I somehow picked that up and I saw that there are a lot of people doing the technical work of how to tell a story as a product offering, as a training, all that kind of thing. I think that's important. It's important to learn how to do that thing well, especially as a leader, because for me, vision storytelling is a key leadership skill, just like the art of asking really powerful questions.
Absolutely.
Or space for the bigger
Absolutely.
question. And I think it's seen as a tool or technique rather than a skill set. Mm-hmm. So I think there's something really important about that. But for me, the deeper thing, the mother lode is, can humanity be aware that we are creating the story that we're living in? And it's not being very kind or very helpful to so many trillions of us on the planet. We could decide to form our story in a different way. It's up to us to become aware of that fact and then to do it together. So that, for me, feels like the underlying mission. And where this book came from, actually, is a design to help people step in a bite-sized way into the many possibilities. I see it as like a diamond with many, many facets.
I loved the fact that you also touch on this aspect of the future story, because I'm thinking of it as one of the major reasons why certain leaders achieve so much. And it's because they tell a story that is so clear
Yeah.
that not only people see it, they can relate themselves to that story. They see something of themselves in it, which is why when I work with groups, I always begin with them telling their current stories so that as they write the future story, that the currency comes right through and they can see themselves in it. And then it becomes quite doable because, hey, we know this place, we know it already. And so they go for it. Fabulous.
I mean, that's true of a compelling story, right? It hits you here and it hits you here, the head and the heart at the same time. And that makes your hands kind of go, yeah, I want to engage.
Oh, I like that. Head and heart, hands. Well, speaking of hands, now can we begin to help people do what we've been talking about for themselves, even without your book or without? Is there some, I'll call it an exercise. I promised at the beginning we'd do some kind of exercise. So let me toss the ball to you, Mary Alice. What are something we could do together?
I think the very simplest thing is to think of a traffic light and go, okay, stop. And in Europe, the middle one, the orange one, is the warning that the stop or the start is going to happen. So yeah, so it's a little bit different than in the North American system. But what stories do we need to stop telling? That's the first one. There are stories that get repeated that aren't really helpful. And I'm thinking about one that I experienced with a client in Melbourne, in Australia. This is a group that works with people with disabilities. They had one particular place and it was called David House. I don't know who David was, but this particular place had not been a happy place in past years. It was kind of known for its controlling mechanism. It was not very, very supportive to people with disabilities. And so those stories continued to circulate, although the place itself had been totally revamped. The whole structure had been revamped. The whole organization was in a different place and a different focus than ever before. But still, these stories were alive. Every organization has some stories that I suppose kindly need to be killed off because they keep repeating themselves, but they're not actually true, or they're not valid, or they're not helpful. So it's an interesting thing to think in my own life, in the life of my family, in the life of my organizational structure. What are the stories we need to stop telling? So that David House is one from my working life, but I know from my personal life, one of the stories I need to stop telling is I'm alone, or nobody can see me. I have a very traveling lifestyle. I'm in movement a lot, and sometimes that makes it challenging for people to know where I am. So the first thing people tend to ask me is, where are you? During the pandemic, because I'm not really a place-based person, I realized everybody focused on their own bubble, and therefore I wasn't in any bubble, which made me feel quite lonely. But the more I tell myself I'm alone or nobody sees me, instead of reaching out, the more I get in the drain and polish the sides. That's like, okay, there's the drain, but I don't have to get in it and polish the sides.
That's right. As you're talking, I realized one of the strategies that I used as a division chief at the World Bank, when in any organization, there are rumors and there are, as you say, stories, etc. And people would come to me and they would try to tell me those things, especially if it was based on some real activity. And I would say, I don't really need to know the past. What is it that you're going to do? And I can remember the faces on some of the people who I said that to. It was like, oh, thank goodness I don't have to deal with that. I don't have to justify it anymore. And they went off and did amazing things. And I just did that naturally because I just didn't want to be burdened with their stories. I just said, I can't solve the past. I can only look and work to the present and the future. So thank you for that insight. I just now realized it.
What you were actually asking them to do was to create a different story in response. And that's true. You can't just say this isn't true, because a story has more power than a factoid.
That's right.
So that's why urban legend is so powerful, because stories are much more interesting, right? So you actually have to create a story in the place of what came before. So what story am I telling myself now? So, but there's some stories you need to stop telling. There's some you need to keep telling because they're actually worthwhile and they're building themselves, or it's almost like there's the story of Sedna, which is a story of a young woman being um, married off far away and to someone who turns out to be a sorcerer. So she tries escaping, and her father, drops her into the sea, and so she becomes a skeleton. So Sedna becomes the skeleton woman, and eventually some guy fishes her up and puts her bones back together, and she comes back to life. So there's something about stories that you keep telling that more flesh comes to the bone, more life is breathed into them, more depth comes into them, more gravitas, more truth. So there's something about stories that are helpful that need to keep being told. So what stories are those in your life, in your community, and in your organization?
You know, that one reminds me of is my grandfather. That's my mother's father, who came to this country in the early 1900s, early 20th century. And he said, the first thing I must do is learn English. And so he went to night school to learn English while he was working on whatever he could do. And he didn't tell that story. Other people told it about him. And when I look at that family and the number of degrees that have been gained, I mean, among the grandchildren, there are doctors, there are PhDs, there are lawyers, you name it, because education became constant learning came out of that repetition of that simple story.
Yeah. I think you and I both recently looked at the book Adrift, which is a collection of infographics about what's kind of currently going on in the US, at least. And the infographic, have really shown that immigrants are the entrepreneurs of society. They are actually vast contributors. They always have been in this kind of context. So it's interesting, the story swirling now about what immigration is about. It's interesting. How do we repattern the story? I'm wondering how we actually keep telling the story of what it means to be in a dream of freedom and possibility, because I think that's under threat at the moment as well. So how do we keep telling the stories that really nourish a diverse, a creative, and innovative base of people in whatever format that is, as a family, as an organization, as a community? And how do we tell that story that people live into? I once worked with a group of Afghani civil servants, and I wanted to impress upon them that their leadership capacity was really about telling the vision of the future. And I remembered a story I had heard 10 years before, and I'd read it 10 years. I hadn't seen it in 10 years, so I had to reconstitute it out of my mind, but it was called The Golden City. And in this story, a prince had inherited a really kind of broken down kingdom because his father had let that happen. And people were being taken advantage of, and traders were unsavory and all that stuff. But he consulted all the wise people, and then he decided they didn't really know what they were talking about, but he finally had good advice. And he created something inside of a building which no one could see. And then he started inviting people in there. He invited them in there with the proviso they could come in, but they could never talk about what they had seen. This made everyone very curious, because they noticed that when people came out, they were totally transformed. So eventually the ordinary people begged, we want to go and see this. What is it? We want to see it too. Same thing. You can go in there, but you can't tell what you see. It turns out he had artisans build a picture of what he called the Golden City in 3D relief. This is what we're going to look like.
Yeah.
And it was so inspiring to people that they created it. So, it's like, what story do we want to keep telling?
Yeah.
And then the final piece is, what stories do we need to start telling? Because we need them. So we want to stop telling some because they're not useful anymore. They're harmful. We want to keep telling those things that are really useful. And we want to start telling those things that will help to pattern the future that's good for everybody. And every one of us can take part in that exercise all the time.
Well, that's a cool exercise. I'm not sure I can think of a story right now, because that's a big story. And yeah, it's a big story.
What would it be like? This is the question. When I first went to New Zealand, this was the end of '83. The Rotary Club was doing Buckminster Fuller's game. He had a whole game structured around the exact economic data and all of the kind of community concerns in the monetary view. And so you played this game on top of a satellite map of the world. So everything was in exact proportion. There were people who were standing in for the World Bank and for the International Monetary Fund. And then there were people who were in the media, and every hour the media would report on what was going on. Egypt has decided to sell off the pyramids in order to make the debt, in order to pay for, so we were all young people playing this game. And they stopped it at one point in time and showed us how much was being spent on armament around the world. And we knew how much it would take to solve the hunger problem. And they had us stand around the map and said, so what do you choose to do? And we looked at each other and we said, it's pretty clear there's enough resource for everyone on this planet. Why don't we share it?
Beautiful. Beautiful.
So that's interesting. What story are you going to tell?
All right. So we basically have given folks an exercise they can do on their own. And of course, they can find someone to tell those stories to if they wish. And they could come to the dojo. But I think at this point, I want to say thank you so much for, as always, a wonderful conversation. And do you have any final words that you want to convey to people? Because, I have a lot of most of my audience are career women who are between the ages of 25, 50, somewhere in there, where they're real aspiring. So final words.
Firstly, that is, thank you for listening, and thank you for participating in the exercise, because I know you will help to change the world by doing that. So thank you for that. Second is, I want to give a gift to this audience, and I'll give Madeline a link to get an excerpt from my book that will be in the show notes for you. And finally, the final word is to be courageous, both with your own story and inviting stories. I have a friend here in Columbus, Ohio, who used to be the head of 4 medical associations. And he practiced using circle regularly with what he called his kitchen cabinet. So all of the leaders would sit in circle together and really be real with each other. And the assistants also had their own kitchen cabinet circle practice. That went on for 13 years until he retired. And I said to him, why is it that more leaders don't use participatory practice in engaging with their people? He said, do you really want to know? I said, yeah, I do. And he said, it's because secretly they know that if they engage with people like this in a real way, sharing their conversations, sharing their stories, they're going to fall in love with them. And they're concerned deep down that they know they'll be hurt because things will change. So, it takes courage to do this kind of work. It's very simple. Simple doesn't mean it's necessarily easy. It's very simple to invite people to share who they are. It's not so easy to keep that kind of space that truly invites them in. But if you have a bit of courage, even some everyday courage, that can be possible.
Mary Alice, as always, thank you. My sincere appreciation for your time and gems that you gave us today.
Thank you.
Always fun to talk with her. Well, now it's time for my new segment, which, by the way, I have not named. So if you have any ideas about what it should be named and called, etc., you just email me. You see the email address right there on the screen. But it's going to be where I talk about books that have made a significant impact on my life and my career. You see, I grew up being told to bring a gift when you're visiting someone's home for dinner or maybe an overnight stay. Also, remember to gift someone who has gifted me. Oh, and keep track of the chits I owe in business. In commerce, at the end of a transaction, the participants are freed from each other. It's as if the relationship never happened. The relationship or community is neither built nor maintained. Life becomes a set of transactions. I was beginning to feel that as Mary Alice was talking about where we are today. But then I read The Gift by Lewis Hyde. He begins by telling you about other cultures where a gift was not an individual transaction. In fact, it was not a transaction at all. It was rather an expression of appreciation of the community's support of you, perhaps through this individual. It was meant to build the relationship and the community. So the social fabric was not rent, but reinforced. So if I did something for you in a business situation, instead of it being done to stack up chits, it could be done so that the social fabric of the businesses was strengthened along with increased productivity or revenue, and it came out of the intention of giving to the whole instead of for the self. Keep in mind, the social fabric of the organization supports everyone, not just you. Think about that. The social fabric of the business is about teamwork, trust, commitment, clarity, curiosity, creativity, all the things we hope to create in an organization that leads to increased productivity as a natural outcome. In other words, as a leader, you don't have to constantly invest in motivating staff. They motivate themselves. And as a result of reading Hyde's book, The Gift, my work within organizations changed entirely. And my understanding of how to gift others was freed as well. I no longer worried that my gift was not big enough or maybe too generous. It was what I thought would be best for the other person as they lived their life in their community. I think of the establishments that I return to again and again. I hope you know what I'm talking about. It's that store where they remember who you are and know what you need even before you say it. And I'm not talking about AI here. I'm talking about a person who remembers because they see your face and know you. You know, my bank had a branch in my local town. It was like 3 miles away. But in a move to improve efficiency and revenue, they closed that branch. And they told me there were 3 others I could use. Well, when I went to one of them, the only thing that made me feel I was working with the same bank was recognizing one of the tellers from the closed branch who had transferred there. We greeted each other as if we were old friends. It made my transition to the new bank much easier. Lewis Hyde, The Gift. Thank you for joining me today. Curious about the background of this show? I hope you'll check out my book, Unlocked, Discover How to Embrace the Unexpected, available on Kindle, audio, and paperback. And if you would like to explore what it means to build and nurture your resilience with me as your mentor, schedule a conversation by sending me an email to madeline@madelineblair.com. And of course, you can learn about what's coming up on Unlocked by coming to my website, madelineblair.com/unlockedtv. All the replays are there so that you can watch whatever you feel like. If you have a topic you'd like to see me cover, email me at madeline@madelineblair.com. I promise to read and work to find the best guest to respond to it. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Unlocked. And if you did, make a comment in social media about what you learned and might do differently as a result. And if you're on YouTube, click the like button. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. I'm Madeline Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.